This idea that all the countries, even the little weak countries, get to be sovereign and make their own choices. And I think a lot of sort of leftist people are like, well, that was never true, and they're right.
Hello and welcome to the More Freedom Foundation podcast. I'm Rory, in charge of podcasting, and with me as always is Rob. How are you this time?
Not bad, not bad. It's a beautiful day here in New York City.
Okay.
We're due one, so everything's coming up okay in New York. How are things with you?
Well, I'm doing something that might be something linked to this episode.
Oh, yeah?
This weekend, I plan to go to Britain so I can buy another electric car because I'm a bit worried. I've been wanting one for a while. It's one of those things I just always want another electric car.
Mhm.
But it feels like if things could keep going the way they're going, that fuel prices might go insane, or so the whole world may be a bit different. So
Honestly,
cars are cheaper in Britain because we're technically sort of in the EU.
mhm,
And I get the feeling there's a lot of fearful people in Cuba that are relying
mhm.
on more electrics than they used to.
Oh, no question. But just on the topic of oil prices more broadly, it is fascinating, and it's been very surprising to me how the prices have been very slow in reflecting just the extent of this crisis. I think I've talked a lot about how in 2022 we talked a lot about mass starvation and agriculture and this, that, and the other thing because 10% of world oil and gas production coming out of Russia might have been interrupted, and in practice never really was. When pretty much starting from Trump's invasion of Iran on February 28th, and we're recording this most of a month later, like 20% of world oil and gas production stopped. And it is been pretty extraordinary and pretty sleazy watching the extent to which Donald Trump has been working to game the markets.
Yes.
You can really time developments in this war based on every Friday evening. Donald Trump is just rabid. We're bringing fire and brimstone and da 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 da. And then Monday morning, right before the markets open, this has now happened multiple times. He's like, "Hey, we're having great conversations with the Iranians, and this could be over tomorrow." Despite the fact that the Iranians are like, "We don't know what conversations he's having." So
Yes.
that aspect of it is pretty pathetic. But what's even more pathetic would be the way that the markets have treated this, the way that they have.
Well, everything's finance. The real world is just a thing you can exploit.
Exactly. And I think, honestly, we wouldn't, but if we had a Joe Biden or a Kamala Harris who had done the same things that Trump had ended up with the same situation that Trump had, I believe the markets would be a more honest reflection of reality, because it's just a fact, and I've been talking about this for years, that the people who make markets, the wealthy people who make the investments, the media organizations that drive the narratives, that drive the markets, and just the physical traders themselves all tend to like Donald Trump and want things to go well for him. So if Joe Biden had been trying the kinds of nonsense that Donald Trump has been pulling in terms of scheduling the war around market openings and closings, I don't think the market would have allowed him to get away with that. There are enough players on Wall Street that really enjoy having Donald Trump in power and want to perpetuate Republican power, that they're basically letting him off. And I think it's doing everybody a disservice because it kind of leaves us less prepared for the very
Yeah.
real physical reality of this catastrophe.
But
But
it's also things like the S&P's just been down since the start of the year.
sure, and it's going to keep going down. And it is so Trump's extraordinary market manipulation. You can just watch it working
Is this
on.
the greatest of all time? Because we've heard the thing about, I think you're going to talk about before he does his Truth Social thing, like 15 minutes before, there was a short that was what, like 500 million, something like that?
Oh, I mean, that's been a trend throughout the Trump administration. Clearly, some people now I do there because of what Trump is doing is so predictable. You can imagine that some of these trades are people being like, "Well, look, I bet you I'm willing to put a big amount of money on Trump tacoing again before the market opens." And then he does it. Okay, maybe once or twice, or actually now I assume bigger and bigger bets will be made on that every
Yeah.
Monday morning. But like it's too direct, and for all of these trades to actually be some savvy investor, and they're too large. There's clearly some insider trading going on here. There's no question of that. But it's just the absurdity of this entire show is also distracting us from really important stuff that the U.S. government is doing. And I'm referring specifically
Hmm.
to U.S. policy towards Cuba, which is what I think we're going to spend this
Yeah.
episode mostly talking about, because it's pretty atrocious
Hmm.
and indicates a real shift in the way that the United
Evil.
States has. Sorry, did you say evil?
Yeah.
Yeah, that is appropriate. And it's also a real shift in the way that the United States is conducting its empire.
But it's also the fact that like America has been horrible to Cuba for so long that somehow they've found a way to be even worse.
It is pretty extraordinary. And I think that's part of this shift that I'm talking about. The Trump administration thinks that they're savvy and clever and
Hmm.
brave for discarding a lot of the BS, the sort of a lot of the prettiness around U.S. power, a lot of the pretensions that the
Hmm.
United States has traditionally made, that that other states are sovereign, that other states have a choice, that other countries are allowed to do things, that specifically countries in our hemisphere are allowed to make their own choices. And they think they're really smart and tough and clever, throwing all of that out the window. But I think that's because they don't actually understand how important that illusion is
Hmm.
to the maintenance of U.S. power. It's just another it is in some ways another ramification of October 7th, because even in Trump's first administration, which they certainly did some chaotic and crazy things, it wasn't this blatant. It wasn't this much of the mask falling. The Trump administration's behavior towards Venezuela and towards Cuba is a real indication of throwing out what's worthwhile about the post-1945 order. And what was most worthwhile about the post-1945 order was this idea that all the countries, even the little weak countries, get to be
Hmm.
sovereign and make their own choices. And I think a lot of sort of leftist people are like, well, that was never true. And they're right. That was never true completely, but we did a much better job of pretending. And in that space of pretending, smaller countries could achieve real dignity and like live their lives in freer and more independent ways. And the United States eagerly transitioning its empire from a sort of coalition where, yeah, there's a hidden big stick, but we're
Hmm.
we're quiet about it, into like straight up Genghis Khan, we will crush you if you don't pay tribute, is not good for the longevity of U.S. empire. It's a
But is it not
very
also possible that these smaller countries can help big countries? Because I was recently watching a thing about Shannon Airport that
Mhm,
was saying that Shannon set up the first duty free. It set up the first airport that was technically, not within the country.
mhm,
And that also meant they set up like a free zone, where
mhm.
it's like basically the taxes of the country you're in don't apply. So
Yeah.
it's easier for business. That
Yeah.
made up a free zone that then China copied. So a
Uh,
lot of Chinese free zones are based on one in Ireland, which is something you
sure.
wouldn't think of. So it's there is this idea that big countries should just own everything, but sometimes small countries can help big ones as well.
Well, I don't know. I mean, Rory, as I know you've got some affection for Ireland as a state, and I mean, I have a lot of resentment of the way that Ireland has functioned
Hmm.
as a tax haven, and I think that's something that actually ought to be cleared up a little bit. But that doesn't mean that I want to invade Ireland. That doesn't mean that I want to kidnap the president or prime minister or whatever of the Cayman Islands. Yeah, it doesn't mean that I want to basically bring back 19th century imperialism, and that is definitely what we're seeing in the case of Cuba.
Hmm.
So sometime back, we did kind of like a Cuban historical episode, but I do think it's worth talking a little bit about why the U.S. is so angry at Cuba, and the fact that actually in the 70s and the 80s, 60s, 70s, and 80s, Cubans actually, because of Soviet sponsorship,
Because
had a real impact on, geopolitics, foreign
I
affairs
think
more
just all of
broadly.
their sugar was just bought straight away, so they didn't need to worry about selling that, for instance.
Exactly, and I think it probably inflated prices. So certainly, Cuba was, as we talked about in our last Cuba episode, it was just sort of assumed by a lot of people in the United States for decades, centuries, that Cuba was eventually going to be part of the United States, as just
Hmm.
as obviously California was going to get absorbed, and it didn't ended up happening that way for a variety of historical accidents. Cuba was a slave state, and a lot of northern states didn't want another slave state in the country, so it
Mm.
was sort of preserved through the Civil War. There were other priorities. And then when it finally, sort of came time for the United States to carve Cuba off of the Spanish Empire, weirdly, very aggressive, they call it yellow journalism, very aggressive media that got us into that war, spent a lot of time emphasizing how important the independence of Cuba was. So it was even though during that same war we took Guam, we took the Philippines as like outright U.S.
Yeah,
possessions, it just didn't seem right to talk about Cuban freedom fighters for 5 years and then go and annex Cuba. So we
because I've
we
heard
had
that
to.
the Cubans refer to that as if like they started the war and were doing all right, and then America sort of jumped in at the end.
I think that's a very real. There are. I can't. I don't. It might not have been Havana. Havana. It might have been another
Hmm.
city in Cuba that the rebels were on the verge of taking, and then the U.S. came in and took it from the Spanish, and the rebels didn't get to take it. I think this
Hmm.
is definitely. Perhaps the war would have gone on longer if it weren't for U.S. intervention. Almost certainly, the war would have gone on longer. But I don't think anybody was doubting that the rebels would have eventually won.
Hmm.
And I think it absolutely is true that part of the urgency that the U.S. had to get into the Spanish-American War in 1898 was the idea that the rebels might actually win against Spain, and then
Hmm.
the U.S. might not like what they put in there. So in 1898 and then the subsequent years, the U.S. was able to avoid that and was able to set up an independent Cuba, slightly more than in name only, but it was the way that it functions. There was actually, I believe, an amendment in the Cuban Constitution that explicitly stated the United States could intervene
Okay.
to make sure things went well, which is quite crazy. In a recent Substack post, I talked about the Cuba issues, and I talked about how the Federal Reserve in the 1920s just basically treated Havana and Cuba as if it were another part of the United
Mm.
States. And the sort of the internal central bank of the United States, the Federal Reserve, sort of sent a team to deal with the banking crisis in Cuba in the 1920s. It was certainly had its own government, its own politics, eventually its own dictator, Batista, but it was very, very much subordinated to the United States in ways that it is entirely appropriate for the Cubans to be angry about.
I've heard Batista. It felt like was a bit like what some dictators do, which is he was popular at the start. He genuinely won an election, and then was a
Mhm,
bit like, looks like I'm going to lose. I'm going to
mhm.
just not have any more elections.
Yeah, and I think it's another example that we see often is sort of the closer and closer he got to the United States, the less
Hmm.
and less democratic he got.
Was he particularly incompetent?
I don't think Batista.
Okay.
I haven't reviewed the Batista years for this episode, but it doesn't stick in my head that he was
Hmm.
particularly incompetent. The image that I have of pre-Castro Cuba in the 1950s was more spectacularly corrupt than
Hmm.
spectacularly incompetent. It was the Las Vegas of the day.
Yeah.
It features, I think, doesn't it feature in
In
one of the
Godfather.
one of the Godfather films? I mean, it was a famous nest of organized crime
Hmm.
and vice, and it was
Isn't it
certainly.
seen that the mob was in there before they were in Las Vegas, for instance?
I think that's very likely. I can't recall the exact time. I mean, Las Vegas is really like a 1940s on thing, right? Like,
Hmm.
and Havana was much more established. Havana actually was a larger city, was a large, vibrant city when, back in the 1600s, when most
Yeah.
of the United States was just a
Because
few
wasn't that
religious
where
fanatics on
Spain kept
farms.
a lot of its like administration was done in Cuba for its Americas campaign?
I could be recalling this incorrectly, but I think that the famous shipped fleets of silver and gold shipped out from Havana, I
Yeah.
believe, but don't quote me on that. So very, very, highly developed, but by the 19th century, even before the Spanish-American War, it was becoming a poorer place that was sort of economically.
But that's more of a reflection of what Spain was like at the time.
For sure. And also, like a lot of the Caribbean, in between mass American tourism in the 1960s and the end of slavery, which it was decades later than the U.S. Civil War in a lot of places in the Caribbean. In between, they just didn't really have an economic model that made a ton of
Yeah.
sense. So in the 19th century, Cuba was already sort of economically subservient to the United States. And then when Cuba attained independence from Spain, it became sort of this quasi-independence. And that's what made Fidel Castro's revolution initially so popular in 1959. There was a really interesting, you see this with a lot of revolutions. There was actually kind of a weird moment where the United States was trying to work with Ayatollah Khomeini in Iran in 1979. And it didn't last very long, but the U.S. did convince the Shah to leave. The Shah was
Yeah.
going to leave or die anyway, but the U.S. played a role in making the transition to Khomeini a little bit smoother and was like, and we can keep this relationship with the military going, right? And Khomeini was like, no. But I think there was sort of a similar, different, but a similarly ambivalent, sort of up in the air nature to what happened between, I guess it would have been Eisenhower and Kennedy when Castro initially came to power in 1959. He didn't actually, I believe he took power before announcing that he was a communist,
Okay.
in fact. And there was a fair amount of back and forth. And then it became clear that I don't have the details at my fingertips. For whatever reason, it wasn't going to work. Castro comes out as full communist. And by 1960, so just a year later, we see the beginnings of the sort of sanctions regime that the United States threw on Cuba. And as we got into the early 60s, I mean, we go from, sort of feeling it out, trying to make it work, to, 1959, to sanctions in 1960, to the CIA sponsoring a invasion in 1962, the Bay of Pigs, famously failed, to the Cuban Missile Crisis, which is like the United States might just end the world because of Soviet missiles in Cuba. So very quickly, Cuba, a tiny, tiny place, ran to sort of the center of the imaginary of U.S. foreign policy. This Fidel Castro was the big bad. I think in our current, I think I'm just young enough.
Okay.
And I think you're definitely young enough, and a lot of other most listeners to this podcast are young enough that Muslim bad guys are sort of who has always been the bad guy. There was Saddam Hussein, there was Muammar Gaddafi, and there's a whole sort of ideology around being scared of those guys. But before those guys, so for people in their 50s, 60s, 70s today, it was generally communist baddies. And Fidel Castro was the big one. And it's interesting, we had talked about how they were heavily supported by the Soviet Union, who bought all their sugar at inflated prices. This allowed them to play a really outsized role in Africa specifically, but in other places. The Cubans. Do you know a movie called Red Dawn?
I think I've heard of it. Yeah.
It's classic. It is about a Soviet invasion of the United States in the 1980s.
This is the emergency broadcast system. We are under attack by conventional forces of the Russian army. It is believed the lead waves were disguised as commercial charter flights. Communications have broken down with other parts of the country. Large areas of the Midwest may have been overrun.
It's very funny. There's a very famous movie called Dirty Dancing. You know Dirty Dancing?
Okay. Yeah.
With Patrick Swayze and Jennifer Grey. And the two of them actually star in this movie, which couldn't be more different. It's like a sort of sci-fi war movie put together by a right-wing crank, and it's glorious. It is a very strange artifact. But what's interesting about that film is they talk about the Cubans are sort of the spear of the Soviet invasion, and looked at in 2026, that can seem a little silly. But in the context of the 1980s, the Cubans really were running all over the world fighting against the United States.
Is America allied with China in the film?
Yes.
This thing's quite funny to compare to today.
Yes. Well, I mean, but that was the state of Cold War politics in the 1980s.
Yeah.
But the Cubans played a huge role in sort of defeating South Africa in southern Africa. This was when South Africa was a white supremacist state. They played a huge role in less honorably and impressively in keeping a communist dictatorship in Ethiopia in control despite a Somali invasion in the 1980s. But they were big players. So it may seem ridiculous to see the Cubans invading the United States in that 1980s film Red Dawn, but it seemed plausible. And for people who are just 10 years older than I am, Cuba was always like a main bad guy. And so like the lust for destruction of Cuba is kind of similar to the way that a lot of people who remembered the 80s were excited to take out Gaddafi in 2011, even though he was actively providing services for stability of the world at that point. And that's sort of a species of what's going on here.
What have been some of the worst things sort of Cuba's done to America? Because I'm reminded of the time where they got rid of, he cleansed Cuba of the sick and the poor and threw them all at America, for instance, was quite a despicable act.
Oh, I don't know. I mean, I think that's called the Mariela boat lift in the 1980s. Is that what you're referring to? I think, now that's interesting. I guess that was before the special period. I don't have the details of my fingertips.
For the amount of hate Cuba gets, you think Cuba was like attacking America all the time.
And that's the thing. They really haven't. Mostly, and up until the Trump administration, this is something that has shifted. The United States has worked really, really hard to foster immigration from Cuba. I think the rule was if we catch your boat in the middle of the
we'll send you back.
Yeah, we'll send you back. But if you actually hit U.S. soil, you can apply for U.S. citizenship. That was a long-running privilege that Cuban emigres had because we wanted to undermine Cuba. And I think it's interesting that there's anybody left on Cuba at all. If that was what we were offering, and this government was supposedly so bad.
So the population's roughly 10 million at the moment?
I believe so. Yes, that did finally break down over the past. Certainly during Biden's time, the largest, I don't know if it was the largest population, I think probably the largest population of folks seeking asylum in the United States was Venezuelans, but I believe followed closely by Cubans. And if there's only 10 million Cubans, that means there's a lot of Cubans trying to get off that island. And it does make sense that the Trump administration...
Yeah, this is crazy. The census in 2022 had it around 11 million, and estimates at 2 years ago was 9 million. So that is a big decline.
Yeah, which is extraordinary. The Cuban government is not great. It appears to be sort of a family-run show. There's certainly a lot of ideology that gets into that, but practically speaking, the Castro family and their sons and grandsons seem to run a surprising amount. It's not quite North Korea level, but it is pretty corrupt looking.
According to the Global Human Index, it's sort of around Mexico, sort of like level of wealth, as in like it seems to do a lot better than Central America, for instance, and other like Caribbean countries.
For sure.
But this was before. This was say 3 years ago.
Oh, and
which was still a bad time.
Sure. Well, it's the sponsoring by the Soviet Union, and then later, after the pretty horrific interval of the 1990s, they were heavily sponsored by Venezuela. Venezuela when it was prosperous, and as Venezuela has gotten less and less prosperous, things have.
Well, I remember there was
down.
I listened to that Dave McWilliams podcast a lot, and he has a Caribbean economist on a lot. And she kind of went through him recently, which I thought was good, because she was saying that basically all of the Caribbean is benefiting from Venezuelan oil because they didn't really have money. So he says loads of the Caribbean is indebted to Venezuela through oil. Only like one or two weren't. So there's people seem to find it's odd that, or she finds it odd that like they always pick on Cuba for doing this. It's like we were all at it.
No, that's a valid point. That's a valid point. And I mean, I don't intend to pick on Cuba. I think it's very clear that one of the main things that the United States hated about Cuba was that it demonstrated another pathway. It demonstrated
that's sort of the big stereotype. Maybe it's you think maybe is it a bit too tanky to think it's like, oh, it's such a paradise here, and it would make everyone in America realize how terrible capitalism is.
It is a corrupt government that is run like with a sort of bunker mentality. It's nowhere near as bad as North Korea.
And what about Cuba?
That's good. I like that. It's important, as with North Korea, it is U.S. policy that has made it so. Like that's one of the main points I wanted to get across today, is that while you can certainly make an argument that this is like a family-run business, it's unattractive, it's corrupt, this, that, and the other thing, unlike Venezuela, at no point has this Cuban government ever been able to develop normally without being faced with economic warfare from the United States.
That's the thing that this economist was saying, because David McWilliams liked to sort of criticize Cuba every now and again. He goes, his son went there and didn't like it and says, oh, communism's terrible. And she's like a big, neocon capitalist economist herself. And she was a bit like, we have learned nothing from Cuba other than if you get on the wrong side of America and they cut you off from the world economy, you're not going to do well. And she was just defending it, saying a lot of other countries spend more, the government spends more and gets significantly worse outcomes. So it's like, it's just such a tragedy that we can't really know anything other than try to get on with America the best you can.
Yeah, and that's the thing. So while I think you can make arguments that Venezuela sort of made its own bed and is laying in it, like Cuba just wanted to be free of quite sinister U.S. control.
Yes.
And in return got smacked with massive, massive sanctions and have never been able to develop in a normal way.
So I think the period everyone seems to like within recent memory is the Obama years, or just like, oh my God, we were so happy with Obama. Everything was just sort of okay.
Well, and there were two things that were working very positively for Cuba at that point, which is up until 2014, at least, Venezuela, despite very real mismanagement, was still just raking in tons and tons of resource wealth until 2014 or thereabouts. And what really changed that was the bottom of the oil market dropping out in 2014, and then the Trump sanctions in 2017 against Venezuela.
Trump and Biden sanctions, apparently they see it as, because Biden didn't really lift much.
He really didn't. But yeah, Obama was willing. Didn't he like go to Havana and play baseball or something like that? And and there was a real opening. And it's interesting. One of the things that he pointed to was the fact that Cuba was fighting South Africa while the United States was supporting it.
Yes.
Which is a very, very telling point.
Because there were still big sanctions on Cuba, even through what are considered the good years, which is also what's very impressive.
Well, so when Cuba had the support of the Soviets, I think that was kind of a golden age for Cuba. That was when, and to be clear, Batista and the dictator and all the dictators before him, ran Cuba for the benefit of a small ruling class of Cubans and U.S. investors. That's who mattered. So in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, Cuba was able to become a human development indicator miracle because there was a lot of low-hanging fruit that the Cuba's dictatorial and U.S. masters had never handled before. Literacy, basic healthcare. And I do think that when they did have Soviet and Venezuelan resources behind them, I think most people agree that what Cuba accomplished in its medical sector with healthcare and whatnot was pretty miraculous. And yeah, like Cuba obviously is a system that tried to do something else and will never be able to say
like a much better cultural revolution, because there's a bit where like it was taking academics and making them go into the villages to teach everyone to read. It was like lots of things that seem to go not too badly.
Sure. And it's they tried a lot of different things that were very interesting, and we'll never know how successful they could have been because the United States has just constantly made an enemy of it. The 1990s in particular were catastrophic for Cuba.
Because they're massive, like whoever was basically buying any resource they had, because obviously what they had was very different to what the Soviet Union would traditionally have, was like they're buying nothing. And you're not plugged into the American system, so what do you do?
And it's in the 1990s when the United States, I think it's the Helms-Burton Act, there was a lot of pushback from Europe and other places, but we see a lot of pushback. But the practical, this is when the U.S. started rolling out secondary sanctions, withheld the Helms-Burton Act, or at least trying to. So not only were the Soviets gone, but the U.S. started making it harder and harder for Cuba to do business with anybody else. And this is known as the special period in Cuban history, where Fidel was still very much in charge. Fidel Castro took power in 1959 and died in 2016, but didn't really leave power until 2011, which is crazy if you think about it.
Well, I think isn't the sort of factoid about his death is like it was the longest obituary in the New York Times.
I'd believe that. Because there were probably a lot of people who'd contributed to writing that who had died a long time ago. So the 1990s, Fidel Castro found himself overseeing, it's like kind of a new economic plan, basically the small scale liberalization of the communist state of Cuba, opening of tourist companies, just any way to get foreign currency in. And while Fidel's system was sort of saved by Venezuela from the late 90s and the early aughts, those shifts never were completely changed, never completely gone back. Though this morning I was reading a lot about the Grupo de Administración Empresarial, which is basically our Gaza, I'm not sure if I pronounced that appropriately, which is the military-run group that apparently runs something like 40% of the Cuban economy. I guess you can be like, oh, well, that's the government running the economy, right? That's communism. That's supposed to be the way it works, right? But it seems that it seems like it works a lot more like, say, the Egyptian military running most of the Egyptian economy, or a lot of other examples, and it doesn't seem like a very good thing. Raul Castro's son-in-law ran Gaza for a very long time until he died in 2022. And a lot of the way that Cuba runs today, and I think we should just spend a minute or two. It's interesting, like, functionally, it doesn't really necessarily matter so much what Cuba's government is like. It is U.S. policy that is the main determinant of what happens there. But it is worth just talking a little bit about how the government functions there. Fidel Castro died in 2016, and I think stepped back from government more or less in 2011 and handed power off to his younger brother.
Yes.
Who was 10 years younger. So really from 1959 until 2019, Cuba was run by the Castro brothers. And when Fidel Castro came into power in 1959, I think Raul Castro was already running the military. So that, I mean, just an extraordinarily long time being run. And Raul Castro is still alive. He's 94 years old. He stepped back from day-to-day control of the government in 2019, but he's apparently still very, very important. Miguel Diaz-Canel is, I guess, the president of Cuba, though, as with a lot of communist systems, he became the president of something in 2019 and like the general secretary of something else in 2021. And it does seem like this guy's in charge enough for the Trump administration to now be requiring that he step down as sort of like the first step or whatever in there.
Okay.
So yeah, Miguel Diaz-Canel, but it appears that just as one indicator of how powerful the Castro family remains, there's a 40-year-old grandson of Raul Castro, Raul Guillermo Rodriguez Castro, is apparently the main negotiator with Marco Rubio.
Okay.
And the U.S. government. So
what a terrifying man to work with, Marco Rubio.
Yes, he really. I always saw Marco Rubio as a joke, and I still see him as a joke.
Little Rubio those days.
Yes, little Marco.
That's it. Yeah.
And I still see him as a joke, but his role in the Trump administration is probably the only
But is
person
that
there.
not quite terrifying? Someone who is a joke in a massive amount of power?
That is exactly. That's very terrifying. And
Because it kind of makes having your little brother run the country seem not as bad.
yeah. Yeah, I think my little brother would do a better job, frankly. And he also appears to be the only person in the Trump administration who like reads above a third grade level. There's this genre of articles talking about how intellectually formidable Marco Rubio is because he literally read like a popular Winston Churchill biography once.
Okay.
Like it's just like the bar is so low. Like it's like, your grandpa, Marco Rubio read one of the easy reading Winston Churchill biographies that everybody's grandpa reads. So he's a titan of intellect. And sadly, in the Trump administration, that's kind of true. And I think it is fair to see his hand as sort of the guiding force behind both Venezuela and Cuba policies.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
So yeah, the Cuban government, not super attractive, definitely run as a family business here. But yes, that should not detract from its incredible accomplishments in prior decades in healthcare, in education, and literacy. And it makes it just so sad that the United States seems to be so dedicated to crushing it, crushing this
seems like it's had a horrible, would it be a triple effect? So we have the sort of calming with Obama, and then Trump comes in, destroys them, puts in then even harder sanctions than before. Then COVID wrecks things even more. They seem to have a very good at preventing the spread of COVID. I think there's also the whole debacle where it's like they wanted to get stuff. What was it? They wanted to get vaccines from America, but America was like, only if private companies distribute it. And that whole thing. And now we're into the horror of basically a siege.
Yeah. And I think that's very on point, that things have just gotten worse and worse and worse. It's not even necessarily that moment with Obama was like so all fired awesome. It's just that everything since has been so much worse.
Yeah, it's like someone, I don't know, like you're being tortured and they've taken a coffee break for a bit. It's still not a good situation, but it's better than all the other times.
No. So things were already disastrous. The Venezuelan before this year, but things got especially more disastrous this year. Cuba remained up until January 3rd, and the kidnap of Maduro remained somewhat dependent on Venezuelan oil and gas imports. But of course, Venezuela was falling apart from the instantiation of the Trump sanctions in 2017, harsher sanctions on Venezuela in 2019. Initial Trump sanctions, 2017, harsher Trump sanctions in 2019. Venezuela got creamed by COVID as well, and exodus and starvation, this, that, and the other thing. Mexico, it appears, did sort of step up. Mexico being run by left-leaning governments under Morena, AMLO, and then Claudia Sheinbaum. So there was enough to keep Cuba limping along on January 3rd. Cuba apparently requires about 100,000 barrels of oil a day to function, which is pretty extraordinary. So that's about a 30th of the population of the United States, or like a 34th of the population, and a 200th of the U.S. oil barrel demand, estimated, which is just, I don't know if that's an indicator of Cuba's poverty or whatever. So the 100,000 barrels a day. I did not...
A bit of both.
Yeah, I did.
American access and Cuban poverty.
Yes. And I didn't realize this before this morning's research, but apparently they produce like 40,000 barrels a day themselves.
Yeah, it reminds me a wee bit of say Britain or China. They're producing some, but it's not enough to serve them, so they need to buy more in the open market.
So there's that deficit of 60,000 barrels a day that was served by a combination of Venezuela and Mexico, sort of keeping things going. January 3rd, the United States kidnaps Maduro, weirdly leaves Maduro's regime in place, but one of the few...
Well, I think it's sort of like the least, it's like, it looks like we did something.
Yeah, it looks like we did something.
Which I feel like is a lot of the Trump administration. It's like, yeah, we got rid of the big evil man in charge, but just keep everything as it is and we'll steal your oil.
Pretty much, yeah. And that's the key thing, is that the oil is being stolen.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the few things that have actually changed is that Venezuela was required under the new sort of Trump socialist regime to stop exporting any oil to Venezuela. That's January 3rd. On January 29th, it gets worse. The Trump administration issues a executive order essentially saying that anybody who exports oil to Cuba will be hyper-tariffed. And it's, of course, the way that the Trump administration uses tariffs, it's sort of like a sanction.
It just seems to be whatever's evil and somehow will make Trump and his cronies like crazy amounts of money.
Yeah, that does definitely seem to be
But there's
a
another thing. I was listening to the a TrueAnon podcast, and they were saying one thing that happens is if Rob was to split a bill with someone else in America and use one of these apps to split the bill, and he says, "Oh, thanks for the Cuban sandwich," there's a possibility that will be blocked because it has the word Cuban in it. Equally, if two Europeans are doing something similar, also a possibility. So two countries that are doing nothing with Cuba or America, it's like, oh, that's his Cuba. Let's investigate this. So the controls on Cuba are outstanding.
Yeah, if Cuba and Iran have that in common. It is quite bleak. So the January 29th executive order did not mention Mexico by name, but was very clearly targeted at Mexico. And Mexico is willing to send humanitarian goods, but has said, we protest this. We think this is bad, but we're not going to violate it.
Wasn't the Trump administration sort of nearly forced to not invade Mexico at one point?
I think that it's an open question whether the Trump administration already has invaded Mexico.
Okay.
You'll recall there was I think that we don't hear about it so much, but I think that the Sheinbaum government is engaged essentially in ongoing negotiations with the United States to keep the United States from invading Mexico. And by invading Mexico, I don't mean like rolling in with the 82nd Airborne or anything. I mean basically special forces operating in Mexico without the Mexican government's permission. And I think that Mexico, a couple of weeks back, usually more peaceful state of Jalisco, Guadalajara, I think is the capital of Jalisco. I've been there many times, lovely place, was roiled by narco violence because Mexico had attempted to arrest and ended up killing the leader of I think it's the Jalisco New Generation cartel. And it was like, oh, wow, aren't these cartels terrible? Would Mexico have taken that destabilizing action if it weren't for U.S. pressure? That's a really, basically like, oh God, we better go get this guy, or they're going to send in the Navy SEALs, and then maybe, and then it's tremendously embarrassing for us, and maybe some SEALs get killed, and So like,
but what I mean is like Mexico is genuinely afraid if they don't do what America says.
yes.
Trump will do. It's less likely now considering how terrible Iran has gone, but who knows?
Well, that's a really interesting. So there's two things I want to talk about. First is the way that Cuba smudges a lot of our categories. Like we definitely sanction Cuba. We definitely sort of sanction Mexico to keep them from or threatened Mexico with sanctions. But it's kind of not. Like there are tariffs, which are meant to be like an economic thing that are done for economic reasons. And Trump has really smudged things by he now uses tariffs the way that prior administrations used sanctions.
Well, because tariffs would normally be like 1 or 2% here or there, while this is like 50% or something crazy.
I think that's a fair thing to say. But I mean, tariffs can be crazy. They can be crazy like fully through World Trade Organization adjudication. But I agree that like just the high numbers, but just that like he's using tariffs for things that sanctions are more appropriate for. Like tariffs before Trump are mostly like, this is economic management. This is something we need to do for the U.S. economy, or this other economy is doing something that's not fair with their trade or subsidies regimes, this, that, and the other thing. Whereas sanctions is supposed to be we punish a country and make them, and maybe the distinction isn't that clear, but I think it's probably a bad thing that Trump is smudging that distinction further. But then there's another level to that, which is with Cuba, we're not really talking about sanctions the way we're talking about it with other countries, because what we've been doing to Cuba since 1960 actually predates all of the other sanctions that the United States does. So I think that's just worth mentioning, the weirdness of that.
Just as I was saying at the beginning, I'm kind of worried about oil. A few other countries, I think Sri Lanka is having a, a 4-day week because they're worried about oil. But Cuba's had to worry about oil for a very long time now, and it's just become incredibly dire. How do you think the Iran war is affecting this?
Well, initially I was looking at Cuba and thinking, well, maybe Iran has kind of saved Cuba, because it's well documented that Iraq, being such a mess for the Bush administration, kind of saved for a little while, saved Syria and Iran and Libya and Yemen, all these countries that the Bush administration really wanted. They're like, okay, we're going to knock off Iraq and then we're going to go do all these other countries. And because Iraq was such a debacle, those countries were able to survive to get knocked off by the Obama administration. But, and I was like, okay, so maybe Cuba's been saved by this, but actually, no matter how Iran goes, I think it's bad for Cuba. So if Trump had been able to do exactly what he did, and that's what he thought he could do in Iran, he thought that he could do what he did in Venezuela, which is just replace Maduro with his vice president, do a deal with the vice president, move on. It's clear that he thought he could do that in Iran, but Israel kind of screwed it up by killing everybody he thought he could negotiate with. Not that that was likely to work anyway in Iran, but say he had pulled that off. If he had pulled that off, so it would have been January 3rd, he takes out Venezuela, March 1st or 2nd, he's got to deal with Iran. And then probably by early April, by the time this is being published, he would have been trying to do regime change in Cuba too, to pull off this incredible shift in a couple months. So that might have been slowed down a little bit by the fiasco that Iran already is 1 month in. But I think that if Trump gets entirely humiliated in Iran, he's probably really going to want to find something easy to call a win. And unfortunately, I think Cuba is that easy win.
I've also just had a horrible thought. You know how ICE is struggling to find immigrants, so they're now going to airports to get them?
Yeah.
If you create a refugee crisis, then you can just arrest them all. Like, it's like a perfect, horrible, self-feeding loop of misery.
100%. Yeah. 100%. It is. And there is absolutely a self-feeding loop of misery going on with Cuba right now. People are leaving in droves. There are multiple days where the entire city of Havana does not have power.
Well, that's what from the TrueAnon I was listening to. He had said he'd been there back in the Obama days, and then they went recently. And he says there's just no young people. They're all gone, and it's all dark, and there's no cars.
I put out a very alarmist Substack a couple weeks, maybe a month ago back, that I still believe to be true and worth an alarm worth saying, which is like, is Cuba like the next Gaza? Like not in terms of bombing it to rubble, which is possible, but because we're starving, literally starving the place. Like if you block oil and gas from a country, you mean that the trucks that get food out to people cannot operate.
Well, what I keep hearing is about the doctors that they have to then do like manual like resuscitations and like ventilation, like they're doing what a ventilator would do to patients. So there's like, what I heard was parents were saying that like at the start they find this traumatic, but it's the power cuts out so often. They're like, oh yeah, once they get their phone out and get the light up and running, it's like normal. And it's like, this is just horrible to watch, like children and other patients to constantly have to switch between power cuts and having some power. And also the equipment they have is so archaic.
It was already a horrific situation, and we're now taking away the basest rudiments. The Russians were saying, F it, we're gonna run this blockade again, a real flashback to the 1960s. and then they decided better.
I think they're trying it again. By the time this goes out, it maybe went through. They're trying it again. Well, what's interesting is that tanker could fuel them for like a couple of weeks, which would be a huge relief if that like one ship got through.
Oh, because I thought that the last Russian ship had turned back on February 28th, but they're trying
Russian
it again.
oil tanker nears Cuba in test of U.S. resolve and blockade on France 24. That's a couple of hours old, so
we'll
know by the time this goes out.
Well, that
so weirdly, I'm rooting for Russia.
Yeah, and it is a strange flashback to the 1960s. It does seem, I didn't chase this down as to the extent that I wanted, but it does seem like Trump was a little bit deterred by the level of outrage there was around. So it seems like there's some halfway commitment from the U.S. government to make sure that there isn't mass starvation in Cuba. I don't know. I mean, sure, they can say they don't want that, but this is the Trump crew. They tend to gravitate towards brutality and tend to be stupid when they try to carry out anything that's positive. These are the people who told us that, oh, actually, we killed USAID, but nobody's really going to be hurt by this. So I still think that large-scale starvation in Cuba is a real possibility that we should be on the lookout for.
Yeah.
What I think is really depressing here is I think that the Trump administration, I think that there will be some kind of regime change or some kind of like Delcy Rodriguez plus deal with Cuba this year. I think that Trump will successfully pressure Cuba in some way.
Well, I think Raul Castro has been invited for talks in America, so who knows where that'll land.
Well, I don't think not the 94. You mean Raul, his grandson?
Yeah.
His grandson, Raul.
The old man.
The old man has been invited for talks in the United States. Sounds unlikely to me, but I do think that it's entirely possible that some kind of, and this is the extraordinary thing, is the family, the folks that the Trump administration would be doing a deal with would be the Castros, you know, so it's almost as if the Castro family knew something like this might happen. So they set up Miguel Diaz-Canel as like somebody that can be sacrificed. But I think that if you combine Cuba, the U.S. has demonstrated willingness to use military force in Latin America, which is it is not a new thing. But it is something we haven't done as openly and disgustingly, with the exception of like Panama and Grenada, but those are exceptions that almost prove the rule because they were very strange, very brief episodes in the 80s and the 1990s, justified by hypercommunism, justified by not a fantasy of narcotics trafficking, but like a very real role that Manuel Noriega had at the heart of drug trafficking or the financing thereof. But generally, the United States has not been just hauling off and invading countries since the 1920s, really.
But another thing you brought up is something that apparently Cuba is brilliant at is stopping drug trafficking, which is something that apparently they work with their Coast Guard works with the American Coast Guard. There seems to be very strict sanctions or imprisonment for trafficking drugs. So drugs don't seem to traffic from Cuba. So they're sort of claiming that we're like this big shield that makes things awkward and difficult. And your big thing is, we're going after narco-terrorists when we've been doing nothing but doing our best to help you. It'll help them as well. But it's just like, there's another thing where you're like, their big excuse. And then it's like, oh, wait, actually this was helping us. And what the Trumps may create could be significantly worse for America.
No, we are angry because we feel disrespected. And there are enough baby boomers who remember being humiliated by Cuba as sort of like a childhood thing that one of the most depressing things I saw was that certainly in the Trump administration, with him being historically unpopular, you have sort of figures of party registration, state by state, party by party. And the registration for Democrats is up a little bit, but the registration for independents is skyrocketing, and the registration for Republicans is plummeting across the country, except for Florida. In Florida, The Republican people are identifying as Republican. It's going up by thousands and thousands because it's really true that brutalizing Latin America is incredibly popular in Florida. And the shift that Trump has made, that he's bringing back since the 1920s, over the past century, the United States has invaded Grenada and Panama. This year, the United States has invaded Venezuela, and it's likely that
soft invasion of Mexico.
I think so that idea, that sort of threats and usage of weird U.S. bureaucracies in surreptitious ways, that's actually, I mean, that's more characteristic of so Trump's policy towards Mexico so far is much more reminiscent of what the U.S. has been doing in Latin America all the time. Like, just sort of pressure and intelligence community, special forces stuff, but open invasions. And I think what's different from the way that Trump angrily facing Cuba today is, whether he loses humiliatingly in Iran or it's a triumph or most likely somewhere in between, it's different from how Obama, Bush, Reagan, Bush, Carter, Ford, Nixon, Johnson, and Kennedy. It's different because when they looked at them, there wasn't as a threat of, we're just going to invade you, we're just going to hyperbomb you. Because in that era, the United States was still, the pre-Trump era, the United States was still interested in preserving the fiction that other countries were independent and had sovereignty. And I think that the Castro family is going to be pretty willing to make a further deal with the Trump administration when you've got not just the incredible economic plight of the island at this point, you've also got, I think, a very real threat that Trump could just start bombing Havana or send in special forces. Or, I mean, Iran clearly has intimidated the United States out of sending in large numbers of troops. That could be corrected by the time this. But as of this recording, it looks very likely that Iran has proved itself to be too proficient militarily for the U.S. Special Forces or troops to be a real threat. The U.S. Special Forces humiliated Venezuela, just absolutely. I mean,
also Cuba, because the guards were Cuban.
Yep, killed hundreds of Cuban and Venezuelan soldiers, a handful of Venezuelan civilians, and marched in and took their president and his wife without a scratch. I don't know that that's going to be the case in Cuba, but I think that the Trump administration sure thinks it would be. So I think that the threat of military force against Cuba is more real than it has ever been. So I think this is a tremendously dangerous situation that we need to pay more attention to. I think it's likely that Trump is going to get some kind of deal that he's going to be able to celebrate with the Cuba.
Are we forgetting the communist country in the room, China? Like, can you see it having much sway? Is China going to be sort of its savior, or just a country that Cuba looks to more so in the future? Because I keep hearing about, they're giving them so many solar panels, which are helping.
I doubt it. Because it's not, the U.S. military-industrial complex has sort of propaganda has always tremendously overemphasized the role that China plays in the U.S. hemisphere. In the Americas. It just has never, like, the headlines are like, oh, wow, look, Venezuela's, China's not doing anything to help Venezuela. And it's like, anybody who believed that China, like there was no reason to believe that China actually would help Venezuela, nor is there reason to believe that China would step in some way to help Cuba. It's clear that the Cuban solar utilization is going through the roof.
Yeah, I think it's about 20% of their grid's now solar.
It's extraordinary. And I think they want to get there by 2030 or 25% or something like that. And it's a tremendous uptake. And I'm sure China is providing some of those resources for cheaper than below, not below cost, but below market rate. And I think China can be relied upon to continue doing that. China probably thinks warmly about Cuba and the way that they've sort of pluckily opposed the United States for decades. But I see zero indication that China's... It's very hard to point to ways that China is concretely helping Iran, which is a place that they have a very serious, supposedly serious cooperation agreement
Except
with.
buying loads of oil, apparently. Apparently they're buying more oil than ever, which is a crazy thing.
Yeah, Iran is exporting more oil since the war started, which is a pretty extraordinary indictment of Donald Trump. But
Yes.
I don't think anybody who listens to this was very impressed with to this podcast was very impressed with Donald Trump at any point. It's bleak looking at Cuba. I mean, honestly, it's like, so do we want Cuba to starve to death, or do we want the Cuba to sign a humiliating deal that sort of goes back on like 80 years of impressive, 65 years of impressive revolutionary vigor? And obviously, yes, we would prefer that they took a crappy deal than to have people starve to death. That's very bleak. That's very sad. But I also think that it has the potential to backfire on the United States going forward. To truly, I said this in the Substack, if we keep treating Latin Americans like Palestinians, eventually we'll start getting the kinds of blowback that the Israelis get from the Palestinians. Puerto Rican sort of freedom fighters or terrorists, depending on how you want to talk about it, shot up the U.S. Congress in the 1950s. And one of the great innovations of Franklin Delano Roosevelt was the good neighbor policy, which...
Yeah. Short-lived?
I mean... It depends on how you put it. During the 1930s, with the distractions of the Depression and the rise of Germany and Japan, Latin American countries were able to exercise their sovereignty in ways that they never really were after, the 1950s. But elements of the FDR good neighbor policy survived from 1945. Arguably until January 3rd, 2026, when Donald Trump kidnapped the leader of Venezuela. The Trump administration, and if they force Cuba into a humiliating deal, which I think is pretty likely, that will be more indication that the United States no longer wants to pretend that freedom, liberty, self-determination are things that exist in Latin America. And I think that the long-term effects of that on the reputation of U.S. empire and just the moral character, such as limited as it was, of U.S. hegemony, it's a bad thing, Rory. It's a bad.
So
bad
China
thing.
wins by doing basically nothing?
As ever, do nothing and win, as they say. Do nothing and win.
Okay.
No.
Well, let's hope the blockade is ended by the time this goes out, but sadly that's unlikely.
It's very unlikely.
Bring back the Obama years, which very rarely is something we say on this podcast.
The second Trump administration is making Obama look a lot better by comparison. A lot better. So, yeah. I can't say this is a happy episode, but
no.
But it's done.
Yes.
So, yeah.
We hope the best for the Cuban people.
Indeed.
All the best, and we will catch you next time. Rob has also started a Substack at themorrisdoctrine.substack.com. We also have a Patreon. Just search The More Freedom Foundation. Rob has an X, aka Twitter, at RobOLaw, and we're also on YouTube. Rob's written a book, Avoiding the British Empire, What It Was and How the US Can Do Better. Music provided by Kevin MacLeod.